Well, hey, PV. I am here with someone who needs no introduction to most of you. If you're from another state and you've just been online with PV since the COVID starts, then maybe you do need a little bit of an introduction, though. So, Brother Joel Anderson, do I call you brother or Brother Dr. Joel Anderson?
It's your choice.
Brother,
Joel. Actually, Joel is a very honorable name from the Old Testament, Jonathan.
yeah, that's right. Well, we named one of ours Joel.
Yes.
Um, so Brother Joel is somebody that I really admire, a longtime PV member, fellow Arkansan. He was a former chancellor at UALR, and he's done a lot of work in the racial reconciliation um, of Black Americans and white Americans, specifically Christians. And I was wanting to talk to Brother Joel today, not as a partisan politician, not that either one of us are partisan politicians, but this is a gospel centered thing. It's why conservative Christians and progressive Christians, one of the places that we all overlap is that we recognize that this is a um, a New Testament imperative, and you've been in Arkansas your whole life, or at least a majority of your life, and you've been at PV for a long time, but you've cared about this for a long time. And the more I've heard your story, the more I can tell this is a lifelong passion of yours. What what can you tell us the story about you growing up and what made racial reconciliation such an important piece of following Jesus for you, Brother Joel?
Well, I can, Jonathan, and I appreciate your leadership on this issue. We're in a moment in American history when everybody is talking about this as a result of the George Floyd killing. And I know my Baptist friends here in Little Rock are dealing with it. My Methodist friends are dealing with it. Everybody is talking about it. And I think
Right.
it behooves us to talk about it too. But if you want to know where I come from, and I'm like probably most of the people watching, I find it a little bit awkward to talk about myself and my own life, but for whatever help it might be in this conversation, I grew up on a small farm out east of Swifton, Arkansas, and I picked cotton every fall, probably from age 6 to age 17. And that was an era when Jim Crow ruled supreme. Everything was segregated racially. The church was, the schools were, the swimming pools were, the hospitals were, the restaurants, just literally everything was segregated by race. And I grew up in that environment. I had wonderful Christian parents. In fact, I'm third generation Church of Christ on my mother's side and fourth generation on my father's side. And at that point in time, segregation was something that everybody practiced, and the church, along with other institutions in Southern society, defended it. And there was certainly a great deal of prejudice shown toward African Americans. I witnessed it in any number of situations, but growing up, I thought nothing about it. I thought that was just the way the world was. But then I go to Harding College. It's still college at that point in time in the fall of 1960. And of course, the civil rights movement is beginning to get up ahead of steam at that point in time, but it's still, in the early stage of it. And I go to Harding, and Harding is also segregated. President George Benson, a man that in the next 4 years as a student I came to know rather well and have a great deal of affection and regard for, but he was an outspoken defender of segregation and had resisted ending segregation at Harding. And that was the official line, and no faculty members, publicly or in class disputed that. But, and here is, I think there are lots of lessons in my story, I think, for how today we could cope with this in the church. When I got to Harding, very much of the traditional Southern segregation line, there were a few faculty members who would say privately, and not at much length, but they would say, segregation is wrong.
Hmm.
The way we treat Blacks in this country is wrong. And these were Bible teachers, they were history teachers, they were speech teachers. There was a handful of them. And that really shocked me to hear these people that I admired so much and that were held in high esteem by everyone making these kinds of statements that segregation and the way Blacks were treated was wrong. So that's kind of planted in my head. And then over the next year and a half or 2 years, I'm a freshman while I'm a sophomore, I began to make a slow but steady change in my own perception of this. And, encountered a lot of scripture. After all, growing up in the Church of Christ, we were very much people of the book. And,
Right.
I grew up taking scripture very seriously, as I still do. And, the commitment to conforming one's life to truth was something that was very deep in me. And so I come across, a lot of familiar passages, such as, do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Mm.
We're all created in the image of God. There's in heaven, there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond nor free, male nor female. And you can go on with other relevant passages of scripture. And of course, through the years, I've only noticed that there are more and more of them in the Bible than we noticed for generations upon generations. Even in the Old Testament, there are surprising number of statements. Maybe the book of Jonah being the one of the foremost examples of sort of proclamations of God's concern and interest in all mankind. So over a couple of years there at Harding, I made like a 180-degree change. Now, it may be a little bit of an exaggeration to say it was a full 180, because the fact of the matter is, I've continued to learn and grow ever since then. I think if you grow up in the kind of overwhelming racist environment that I did, then the rest of your life, even if you overcome it, the rest of your life, you're a recovering racist. You've still got a ways to go. You've still got things to learn. So that's kind of how it happened. It was a result of, quiet words, quietly spoken. It was a case of whites changing whites in my case, and in the case, I'm sure, of a number of other Harding students at the time. But that's my story, up until I'm in the middle of my time at Harding College, and that would probably be the most significant part of it.
And then you, and I don't know if this should disqualify you from being a Wednesday night Zoomer, but I heard that you at one point had trouble with the law. So this is a picture, and this is while you were at Harding, but this is not taken at Harding. This is Ole Miss, and I got this picture from a source that does not want to be named, but somebody near and dear to you. It's a picture of Brother Joel being arrested at Ole Miss, and that is you right there. Is that correct?
That's correct.
and this is in a book, is that right? Like a book on history of the civil rights movement?
Yeah, well, it's a pictorial history. It's a book called Powerful Days. And that's a photograph by Charles Moore, the photographer, a civil rights photographer. And yeah, that was certainly an exciting day in my life.
What is going on there, Brother Joel? You're arrested with a guy with a heavy duty artillery gun.
Well, yes, there were soldiers all around us with bayonets, and some of them with gas masks on. But in any case, that comes my junior year. And early that fall, in fact, on the night of September the 30th, four of us who were friends and members of the debate squad at Harding got in a car and headed down to Oxford, Mississippi. Now, this is back in the day when Harding had Saturday classes and not Monday classes. So Monday's going to be a day off. On that Sunday, before we left, Oxford, Mississippi and Ole Miss had been in the news all day long because there was rioting on campus. There was, big face-off between the U.S. Marshals and then in turn the Mississippi National Guard and federal troops on the Ole Miss campus. And there were two people killed that day, and just a lot of things going on. And this was all associated with the admission of James Meredith to the University of Mississippi. He was due to enter that fall, and there had been some resistance, but the next day, on Monday, was the day that it was supposed to happen. But in any case, we drive through the night, we get down there, we're going in on the main highway, we're turned away and told to go home. You understand, this is before interstate, so it took a long time to get there. But we went a ways and then turned off the road and actually ended up down on the square in Oxford. I'm not quite sure how we got there, but it's still dark. And we got out and went into a little cafe and, had toast and coffee. That was all we could afford. And we sat there till daylight. And a little bit after daylight, we started over to where somebody pointed toward the Ole Miss campus. And we had probably not gone 3 or 4 blocks till, from nowhere, from our point of view, these soldiers start surrounding us. And they made us line up, the 4 of us, 2 by 2 at that point, with our hands on top of our heads. And then they start marching us, and over, I don't know, maybe a half hour, they collect a whole bunch of folks that are out. I think some of them less honorable than us. They march us over to the heart of the Ole Miss campus, and that's where this picture is made. And it started a day. I'll try to go through the day very quickly, but we were put down in the basement of the Lyceum building, the administration building, in the basement there for several hours in the morning. And right above us was the registrar's office, where James Meredith and the chief U.S. Marshal during that time actually showed up, and he was admitted to the university. But we were each individually interrogated by the FBI. They took all of our personal effects. And then an hour or two later, they came down and they handcuffed us all 2 by 2 and took us out and put us on these prisoner of war buses that they had out. And the exciting thing about it, I was handcuffed to a guy who the night before had commandeered one of the fire engines. And a tear gas canister had exploded up in the cab where he was. It had gone off there, and he was in bad shape. His eyes were swollen and not a very communicative companion.
That's right. And probably not in a good mood if he was communicating.
But anyway, there are some scary moments during the day. We don't know what's going to happen. The driver got on, started the bus, and the rumor was we were going to be taken and jailed at the Millington Naval Base outside Memphis. But that didn't happen. And one of the funny things was we would hear a radio. There was no air conditioning, so the windows were down on the bus, and we could hear a radio from somewhere. And of course, every hour on the hour, there was a newscast. And the governor of Mississippi would come on, and we would hear this statement. I want to say again, as I've said before, if you're in Mississippi from out of state, please go home. And of course, there was nothing we wanted more to do.
Yeah, that's right. Let us, please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We also got a charge later out. We'd hear the song "If I Had a Hammer" by Peter, Paul, and Mary, and that one seemed appropriate too.
Yeah.
In any case, after a quite worrisome day, it's a. I think when you're fearful, when you worry, is when you don't know what's going to happen next. And we faced that all day long. But finally, probably about 8 p.m., some official got on, called a few names, and we held up our hands, and they came and released several people, including the four of us. And again, we were given those big envelopes that had our billfolds and car keys and everything in them, and were able to find our way back to the car. I'm not sure how, but we found our way back to the car, and then drove home and got here well after midnight. Now I want to hasten to say that I was not a hero that day. I didn't get shot at. I didn't get beaten up. I didn't face down a mob, but I was there.
Yeah.
There on a
and you're in the pictographic history of it. This gives you so much.
Yeah, one of the things
street cred.
You reminded me, my roommate at Harding, who was not one that went on the trip, told us after the Christmas break that he had been sitting in front of the television late in December, late one night, watching one of those highlights of the year programs. And he said he was half asleep, and he just happened to glance at the screen, and there the four of us come marching, surrounded by soldiers and bayonets right front and center on his TV screen. So
there goes your good name.
Yeah, memorable occasion.
For real, I asked you to tell that story because I'd heard you tell it a few months ago, and it's just so cool that you were a part of that, the tip of the spear. One of the challenges, as you and I have talked, for those of you that don't know, Brother Joel is kind of the person that when the racial tension that has always existed in America, when it began to, since George Floyd's killing, because of the city that we both know and love and live in, Little Rock, I called Brother Joel because you've got a track record of doing a lot of good work in this area, and just asked you to be my coach in this because I felt too small and too inexperienced for the occasion. And you gave me a lot of really helpful advice. And one of the things you said, even today when we were talking before this, was you said short conversations on race are almost always pretty frustrating because it's so complicated and there's so much that needs to be said and heard by different people. For example, when we hear the slogan Black Lives Matter, I don't know very many people who would say Black lives don't matter. But some people hear with that, when they hear that, white lives don't matter or Black lives are the only ones that matter. Some people hear the organization that often gets associated with that, about claims of Marxism and all those kind of things. But I unequivocally say, obviously, Black lives matter. They're made in the image of God. They're image bearers just as much as you and I are. The challenge to this is so complicated. What you've helped me think through stuff. What words of advice or wisdom would you have to your fellow church members and anybody with, just goodwill who's trying to listen and learn about racial reconciliation in Little Rock or whatever city they're living in.
Well, and in a moment, I'll say something about the Black Lives Matter issue that you just mentioned, but I would really underscore what you said about short conversations are frustrating. And probably well, beyond question, the most significant experiences that I've had in coming to understand this issue were when I was chancellor, and for the last 7 or 8 years, on all Monday afternoons, if I was in town and did not have a major conflict, I met with a group on campus. It was an informal group. I didn't appoint them, they just came, but it was 18 to 20 or so in about half and half, black and white. And on Monday afternoons, we talked about issues of race, and often it was some current event would be, such as if we had had the George Floyd killing. Now that was something we would probably talked about a Monday or two. We would have talked about it at length. But the reason those conversations were so meaningful and so helpful was that they were unhurried. They weren't short. They could go as long as they needed to. And the people involved, after, it was started, and after a few months, people knew each other and trusted each other.
Right.
And that is very hard to achieve. But in any case, we need, I think, the big opportunity, particularly for white Christians at this point in time, and this goes for the Black Lives Matter idea as well. But I think there's an opportunity now for white Christians to say, this issue is all in the news. And I mean, all of us nowadays are acquainted with African Americans. And we know them well enough that we can say, they're good people. They're normal people like we are. Nonetheless, decade after decade, we have situations like we had with George Floyd or Trayvon Martin or there's a
Breonna
lot
Taylor, yeah.
And our African American friends keep coming forward, saying in a variety of ways, there are problems. They have grievances. They in effect are making pleas for attention. They're saying not everything is well. And
right.
There is discrimination that we're encountering. So the opportunity for us nowadays is to work hard to try to grow and understand that. Where is this coming from? Why, for example, would John Lewis, the representative, the civil rights icon who just died, why did he back in the 1960s do lunch counter sit-ins and get beaten up, do freedom rides and get beaten up, walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and get beaten up by the Alabama state troopers to the point of a skull fracture? And so there are many, many African Americans that in a sense has never stopped. Progress, yes, we've done some backsliding in the meantime, but nonetheless, we've made some progress. But we're being told there is still a ways to go. And we need to develop empathy. We need to come to understand that. And it won't happen without effort. Now, on something like Black Lives Matters, I recall when that first popped up in 2014. And I remember going to a Black Lives Matter gathering on campus, a student gathering with, a bunch of rest of us there as well. And a young Black student spoke about it, and he was so eloquent, and I wished that speech had been recorded and could be played. But he gave a health example, and I'm going to sort of modify it here, but it's very much the sort of thing that he said. If you have a campaign in a community to make women aware of breast cancer, that doesn't mean you don't care about men. It's that there is a problem here. Breast cancer is something serious, and it's something that can be detected. There are things
Yeah.
that you can do about it, and we need to get the word out. Or alternatively, you can turn it to prostate cancer. There are nonprofits. There's an Arkansas Prostate Cancer Foundation, for example, that tries to get the word out to men that, this is a real thing. There's a high percentage, a significant percentage of men that get prostate cancer, but you don't have to die from it. You can detect it early, and then there are treatments. Well, that doesn't mean that you aren't interested in the health of women when you talk about that particular issue.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that you put down heart disease and dealing with other kinds of cancer. It's just that this is something on which attention needs to be focused.
Right.
And that's the point, really.
Yeah.
Of course, it has tended to focus on the criminal justice system, and properly so. Again, we've been, getting messages from our Black friends for decades that there are issues in policing in predominantly African-American communities. And that doesn't mean that all police are bad at all. In fact, policing can generally be good overall, but not necessarily good for everybody that's a part of the system that's being policed. So we need to work hard to come to understand those things. And on something like Black Lives Matter, you can get on the internet and you can find something that is very much for it, if that's what you want to do. You can find things that are said that are bad against it. It's just the way it is. But the movement, the big movement that is represented by all of the spontaneous demonstrations in city after city after city here in the last few months, that was a spontaneous thing that was very much the representation of what had happened initially. Is this is an area of American life that needs attention.
Yeah. I think that's a helpful reframing. And the church is a different politic. It's not Democrat or Republic. It is a way that we care for each other, and it's where the idea or the sense that racism is wrong ever came from. And so, as men and women who have been baptized into Jesus Christ, we are raised to, we are raised up in a new ethnicity altogether. And that's not, I'm not trying to make the argument of we're colorblind. We bring with us our own cultures and all those things, but we all become the new family of God together. And families have to talk and listen and build that kind of trust. And that Monday afternoon conversation thing, that sounds like something that would be really helpful if we could do as a church and develop the kind of trust. Because I've generally had really great experiences with police officers, and my Black brothers that I spent time with, they had several great examples of having positive encounters with police officers, but there were also some painful ones that they had that I did not have. And those kind of sharing life stories tend to help get us out of our tunnel vision of our own experiences.
And Jonathan, in the absence of those conversations, there are still things we can do to develop a fuller understanding and to develop empathy for each other. And conversations are an important part of it, but they can be tricky. There are an awful lot of trigger words and trigger subjects where when they come up, people know where they stand and they're not going to move on it. But there are books, there are movies that can be very helpful.
Do you have any recommendations?
Well, yes, on a book, and to tell you the truth, I don't even know whether it's still available now. But if I go back into, my journey back in my days at Harding, I came across a book, I don't remember how, entitled "Black Like Me," and it was it's by John Howard Griffin, and Griffin was a white reporter, journalist, who went through a process to get his pigment to where it changed colors and became black, and he shaved his head. And then he lived for a number of months in New Orleans and Mobile and over in Atlanta and several other places as a black man. And that book was just so powerful for me.
Huh.
Here I am, I'm hearing the words, it reads like a journal where there's this, one date follows the other in it, and he tells the experiences of that date. And, some of them are scary, some of them are embarrassing, but it was probably the best thing that ever helped me to have a deeper understanding, never a complete understanding, of what it means to live as a black person in the United States. And that's one. Now that's just a book. There are others. One that I recommend, I'm in the process of reading, is by a Harding graduate. We'll just kind of keep things here in the family for a moment.
Yeah.
Jerry Mitchell, who wrote a book entitled Race Against Time. He also is a journalist, by the way, and he's the one that made the
This one.
yes, and he's gone back and investigated some of the old civil rights cases where no one was convicted, and these include the three civil rights workers who were murdered, and you'd be familiar with the movie Mississippi Burning.
Right.
His work in that, and the young girls killed in the church in Birmingham. He went back and in, I think it's 4, maybe 5 different cases, was able to get evidence and bring it forward and actually result in convictions of some of the people who had committed these awful crimes back 30 and 40 years earlier. But the point in reading those, if you're a white person like me trying to understand it, is to read it and ask yourself all the way through, or just, it even helps, I think, if you say, when I'm reading this book or when I'm watching this movie, I'm going to be a black person. I'm going to see what I notice as a black person as I watch this movie. And they're very powerful, but on the other hand, you can go see a movie like Mississippi Burning and see a lot of things that you didn't know about how blacks may have been treated. And then you can walk out of the theater and it make no impression on you at all. Just like listening to a sermon sometimes. We hear a sermon that convicts us, but on the other hand, we can forget it when we walk out the door. And so we need to make an effort. We need to be conscientious. We need to make it a point to grow, to come to understand better. Well, that's a good book. One of my suite mates at Harding, again, not one who went on this trip, but he has written the book entitled White Supremacy, The Myths America Lives By, Richard Hughes, an outstanding scholar. And there's been a pretty good bit of work done by members, scholars in the Churches of Christ of late. We ought to mention Fred Gray,
Right.
Martin Luther King's civil rights attorney, and
Rosa Parks' attorney.
Yes, and there was a piece in the most recent issue of the Christian Chronicle about Fred Gray, and I would commend it to everybody watching. In it, he says that if and I'm paraphrasing, if whites don't think their black brethren are still suffering in America, then there's something wrong with their Christianity. And you need to understand, Fred Gray is true blue Church of Christ. He is a preacher and has been an elder for a long, long time, but he was very much involved in the in many lawsuits against segregation. And by the way, had one of the last conversations 2 or 3 weeks ago with John Lewis, who was a
Huh.
dear friend of his.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
You know, one of the great things about um, having these kind of conversations and working through this with your Christian brothers and sisters is right now, if you're just to get all your information about racial reconciliation or just, racial disparity from the news, which is, obviously beneficial, but it seems like it falls into pretty predictable camps of, if I turn on this channel, I'm going to get this narrative. If I turn on the other channel, I'm going to get
Right.
this narrative. But so uh, for the longest time, I have, chafed at white privilege, or the term white privilege, because I grew up poor and I knew a lot of other white people who grew up poor, and it felt like it just put us all in the same camp. And I think that's where a lot of people were like, it just didn't feel representative of my experience. I didn't grow up like Bill Gates, etc. But when I went on the trip with the 10 black preachers and 10 white preachers, and we went through the civil rights movement on that bus, and we stayed at Tuskegee University, um, when I stayed there, we basically do the Remember the Titans playbook, and a white preacher and a black preacher share a hotel room, and sit on the bus together, and basically just bond. But all that was great, great hearing stories, great playing, singing, worshiping, all that stuff together. But putting myself back to you were there, putting myself in that place, as I take a shower that night, I go to shampoo my hair, and I'm like, what is this? Because it wasn't shampoo for people like me. And that's when I understood, oh, maybe that's what they're talking about when they talk about white privilege. Like, the world that I normally interact with the most is designed for people with hair like me. You know what I mean?
Yes.
That those kind of experiences are what I think open you up to, not just the binary, you're either conservative or progressive, Democrat or Republican, but no, you're Christian and you're trying to understand where your other Christian brothers are coming from. And that transcends things like skin color or political affiliation and all those kind of things, because this is who the Church of Jesus Christ is called to be. Um, that was a long response to your comment, but
Well, I think it's very well said, and I think white supremacy is an example of a subject that needs to be dealt with in long conversations, unhurried conversations.
mm,
And I certainly don't think you or I or anyone else is guilty for acts that we didn't commit. I mean, we didn't hold slaves. However, there is a world that, in a sense, was shaped during that period of time that you and I still benefit from. We need to be aware of that and how it disadvantages African Americans.
yeah,
In yeah, it needs a longer conversation, and I think too, probably most Americans grow up, and certainly it's a thought Christians can identify with, that each one of us ought to try to leave the world a little bit better than it
that's
was
right.
when we found it. So there are things we may not be responsible for. We're not guilty because they happened, but we do share in responsibility today for their presence or their continuation. And we oughtn't to be defensive about that. We ought to be accepting of that.
Yeah, and try. I like that. Leave the world a better place than when you found it. Brother Joel, I'm really grateful for your influence in our city and in our church. And when things go back to normal, I look forward to a continued influence in PV in this regard from you and Miss Ann, and I'm very grateful for y'all in our lives. So thanks so much for taking the time to do this today.
Thanks, Jonathan, and I'll speak to Ann about sharing that picture with you.
Yeah. All right. Appreciate you, Brother Joel.